Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it. Hey, Dr. C here with you. Let's do a deep dive on the iodine content in salt and how salt matters to your health, what are some safe ways to still use it, and the relevance of nutrients in salt. So this is a fun topic. The context is that being aware of your iodine, consuming deliberate amounts of that can go a long ways towards healing your thyroid, making it work better and then keeping it stay stable. And this is cool because salt is one of the easiest substitutions. You can sacrifice nothing for taste and preference and culinary uses and get a better effect for your thyroid by being deliberate in this. So let's talk about why there's iodine in salt. Well, first off, it can be fortified. And this started in Switzerland. They were the first country to start doing that. And it was some regions that did. It wasn't a nationwide effort. The United States did in 1924, and the historical memory is of the little girl with the umbrella and Morton salt. And this came about in response to high rate of goiter among school children in Michigan. Iodine is lowest in the soils in areas that have large bodies of fresh water and are a long ways away from the ocean. So think about all the things around the Great Lakes. Historically, those areas were called goiter belts. Many were low in iodine, and that lack of iodine caused an enlargement of the thyroid, also known as goiter. So this came to a precipice around World War I. Many soldiers that were volunteering to serve were deemed to be medically unfit for duty because of goiters. So Uncle Sam couldn't have that. It was not okay. So they set about some initiatives to help with that. And the first one was fortifying the salt with iodine. And it was a success for its intended purposes. The rates of goiter went down by tenfold or greater. In some schools, rather than 30-40% of the kids having goiters, it was down to 3%, a few percent. So it was a huge success. But what happened was that the rates of autoimmune thyroid disease, they shot up in the following years. And it's pretty fascinating. I've read some historical accounts that talked about the conversations going on. And doctors were not aligned on this idea. There was a lot of strong debates. And even in the first few years, doctors were saying that they were seeing more thyroid disease than they had ever seen before, and that this was clearly the culprit, and it was not a positive thing. So that started right away. That data was tracked, and the region of Olmsted County, which was where the original Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota got going, they were tracking all this. They kept tabs on their rates of autoimmune thyroid disease. And it was a very rare condition in the United States. But in the decades after iodine fortification, the rates of it went up by 26-fold. So it became 26 times more common. And that was thought to be primarily to the greater increase of iodine in the diet. So that's a quick thing about fortifying. Pretty easy to identify and work around. Iodized salts say that they're iodized. And you'll find iodized table salts. There are also iodized sea salt products on the market, but the labeling is pretty clear. They add in 1 part per 10,000 of potassium iodide, also called Ki, K for potassium. Then we can see that iodine is naturally occurring in other versions of salt. And the issue here is that it's really inconsistent. I've read, dozens and dozens of assays of iodine content from various versions of sea salt. And some were looking at the same geographic area. They were looking at one particular study that pops to mind was looking at a region off I'm not going to guess which coast. It was off of a coast in Africa. And samples that were within a matter of, miles apart could have hundreds of times different amounts of iodine per serving. So it just fluctuates tremendously in salts, especially salt that comes from the ocean. And The thoughts too is that in this case, we're talking about the iodine in the salt. We're not talking about the sodium. I won't go too deep on that, but just briefly, uh, I've also put thought at other points into the idea about sodium. And is every speck of it poisonous, or do we need to? Is it a tonic we need to just pound down all day long? And neither of those things are true. For most of you, you can really get a sense of your preferences for salt based upon your taste. It is good to know that your taste buds do attenuate. They do get used to more or less salt. So it can happen that you use a lot more than you really would need just because you've gotten used to some. But yeah, normally if you're using it in your cooking, tiny amounts on the table, not a big thing. If your diet is high in processed foods, you can go way above targets. Most organizations have said that 2,000, 2,500, somewhere around there, milligrams is a healthy amount throughout the course of a day, or a tolerable amount. And if you're cooking foods at home and doing normal cooking methods, you'll probably end up around there. If your diet is highly processed, you can easily blow way past that with some things. And high amounts for some people is a factor for their blood pressure and then therefore their risk for many chronic diseases. There are some to where they're less salt sensitive, but you don't always know who you are. Odd thing is that high salt intakes can cause vascular disease even in those that don't get elevations in blood pressure. So the body has to compensate, and even if it successfully can keep the blood pressure stable, the compensation itself may cause long-term harm and strain on the system. So yeah, so have salt, don't be frightened of it, but also don't think that it's something that you need to be maxing out on a daily basis. So in terms of then about other nutrients in salt, we think about the ideas that you have it based, that salt can contain other minerals. And this has been one of the big arguments for sea salt. Whenever I talk about the fact that most types of sea salt can have a lot of iodine, they can have pretty erratic amounts of it, then one of the first concerns that I hear is, well, yeah, but I eat sea salt because I get minerals from that. And well, it's true. There are a lot of trace minerals in sea salt, but the key word here is trace. They're not there in high amounts. So yeah, I would not encourage factoring in the minerals to your decision of which salt you would use. I'll give some concrete examples here. I had some numbers available for this discussion. So for example, table salt versus Himalayan salt or sea salt, brands of sea salt. So table salt, you're not going to really get any calcium. You're going to get less than a milligram, and that's true for table salt or kosher salt or iodized table salt. Now, if you're talking about sea salt, well, you might get 4 milligrams of calcium. So, yeah, you're thinking about what, 600, 1,000 milligrams per day, and your daily intake of salt, if it's all from sea salt, that's going to be 4 milligrams. We'll come back to that. And then how about potassium? I've heard it argued that sea salt is better because it also has potassium. It does. You'll probably get between about 1 to 4 milligrams. Potassium is something we need in amounts much higher than even calcium. We need somewhere between 2, 3, 4, perhaps 5,000 milligrams of potassium on a daily basis. And sea salt gives you 1 or 4 out of 2,300 milligrams. Not a game changer. Magnesium. And this is something that, I would like to retract some earlier statements I had made. I had seen some assays before arguing that magnesium was 3%. I'm sorry, that sea salt contained about 3% magnesium. That would be substantial, but the source that I found on that, I revisited this, and the source that I found, I now question because I found many other sources, which I think are more reputable, arguing that it's probably more like 0.3%. So I think somewhere had a decimal in the wrong place. And in the past, I had said that it's not a bad idea to consume sea salt because you would get some extra magnesium and it might be helpful. But it seems that the 0.3% is a much more solid number for the amount of magnesium in sea salt. And 0.3 is a whole lot different than 3 in terms of how that plays out. So what that means is you're looking more like between 4 to possibly, being really generous, 20 milligrams of magnesium if you're getting all of your salt from sea salt and you're getting a normal day's salt intake. Iron, salts that are sea salt might give you a third of a milligram of iron, possibly. Some have argued even much less than that, but most I see are between about a tenth and 4/10. So about, yeah, tenth of a milligram, a third of a milligram, probably a typical range for that. And zinc, pretty much none measurable. So there are nutrients, there's really none that are helpful there. And Himalayan salt, I've heard some argue that that's even better. It's honestly the same as far as the mineral content. Perhaps it's about 2, 3 milligrams higher for potassium. But again, we're talking about, 2 to 4 milligrams up to like 6 milligrams, where you need it in the thousands. So also not at all a game changer. And then the Himalayan is no different in terms of the other nutritional minerals. However, it's much higher in iodine. I'll talk about that. So to say I'm going to consume sea salt because it has calcium, potassium, or magnesium, or iron, here's a crazy counterexample, you guys. So here's a food that will give you 10 times the calcium, uh, 20 times the potassium, 5 times the magnesium, and about 3 times the iron as sea salt. That's Doritos. I'm not joking. I'm not recommending Doritos for you guys, but uh, Twinkies have 5 times the calcium of sea salt, and Doritos have 10 times. Doritos have, yeah, 50 milligrams of potassium per serving. That's not where you want to get your potassium from, but I'm just saying you wouldn't really say, I'm going to eat this food because it's got these nutrients when it's got a tiny shadow of the nutrients that total junk food has. So, yeah. And then the iodine really is relevant. So, the amount that we'll find in sea salt, it can be substantial. I see some that can be uh, upwards of 300. I've seen some 400 micrograms of iodine per daily serving. And one of the higher forms is the pink Himalayan salt, which surprised me because that is a land based salt. But even then, even land based salt does come, if you go back far enough, from the ocean. It was a time in which the land wasn't land, when it was underwater. So, yeah, so Himalayan salt, if you're doing 2,300 milligrams of salt per day, of sodium per day from salt, will end up giving you about 230 micrograms of iodine. And with 200 is your upper limit. So iodized table salt will give you about 135 at that same amount. So it's even higher. So yeah, don't put weight on your salt choice based upon the mineral content. The mineral in salt is not relevant. That potassium, the tiniest bite of a carrot or of a few leaves of spinach, any food you eat will give you more potassium than that. And very similar things for magnesium and calcium. Any good plant foods will radically exceed the amounts that are found in that by the smallest bite. So, what kind of salts should you use? Well, if you do like sea salt, there's two good options. There's the Celtic brand light gray sea salt. They make a fine and a coarse ground, and there's Malden's brand sea salt. They make a smoked and a regular version, and that's a finishing salt. We'll talk more about that. You also have pickling salt, also known as canning salt. So why is that different? Well, in the past, it was thought that the iodine in salt could kill bacteria, could have an antimicrobial effect. And if you were pickling something, you want fermentation to occur. You want some bacteria to grow. So there's been a fear that iodized salt would make pickles not pickle properly. They would get in the way of that process. The funny thing, there's a pretty big study done more than a decade ago showing that it's not true. It actually doesn't matter, that there's not enough iodine in iodized salt to get in the way of pickling. But nonetheless, you can go to most supermarkets in the US and you can find salt that's labeled for pickling or for canning purposes. All that is your regular table salt without added iodine. So that's a simple option. I like kosher salt even better. And the reasons for that are more in terms of the culinary effects. So kosher, more so it's a matter of how they're ground and also the fact they have fewer additives. Uh, I've I've dabbled in, culinary skills. I would not at all call myself a chef, but many who are experts in that world, they argue that the iodine and the additives may have some taste effects, which are negative. So kosher salts are really good. There's Morton's brand kosher salt that does have yellow prussate of soda. It's not something I'm frightened of at all, but towards the goal of avoiding additives and odd things, some prefer even cleaner options. And in that case, diamond kosher salt, the ingredient list is salt. There's nothing else in it. It's absolutely pure. And it's also a really nice shape of a diamond-like crystal. Chefs have argued that that shape makes it very evenly cling to foods on the outside. So when you're talking about salt in foods that are cooked that are not boiled or not using large amounts of water, the physical shape of the crystal can make a difference. If you're talking about salt that's going into soup or a broth or into a liquid for boiling, that makes no difference whatsoever because it will dissolve rather promptly. But yeah, the shape can matter for drier versions of cooking, and most top chefs prefer diamond kosher salt. I do see it in some supermarkets, not always, but if you look around a bit, you can often find it. Personally, I've ordered it online, and if you don't mind having a stock of it, getting in larger quantities, it's cost effective and it lasts you a long time. So we just buy a bunch of that every few years, and we're set for a long time. So yeah, that's my favorite one for general cooking use. Then the other one that I love is Malden's brand finishing salt. So this is cool stuff. So if you've ever seen fish scales, imagine something that's even thinner and maybe about a quarter that size. That's what a lot of the flakes of Malden's finishing salt look like. They're these little tiny, super thin flakes. And it's a finishing salt. So after you finish cooking, you intentionally don't give the full amount of salt in the dish as it's on the stove, but on the way to the table, you do a gentle sprinkle of finishing salt over the top. And what happened, and my mouth is water just thinking about this, it's so good. But what happens from that is as you're biting it, you occasionally get a bite of one of these little super thin salt flakes. The actual quantity of sodium is not large, but you get this crunch and you get this pop of the taste. And when that combines with the food, it's so much better than to only have the salt embedded within the food. To have it on the outside just makes the taste contrast so much better. So I love finishing salt. They make a regular version and a smoked version. The smoked version is so insanely good. There's some things that it wouldn't make sense for, dishes that are more sweet or more of a neutral flavor, but things that are savory, things that are seared, boy, that smoked finishing salt is so amazingly good on that. So those are the main yeses. So the big no's, well, iodized table salt, that one's pretty straightforward. Brands of sea salt besides those just two that I mentioned. I've seen a lot of assays of products. There actually is an Icelandic salt, which appears to be just about the same as that Malden salt that I referred to. I'm waiting to hear back from the manufacturers of that, but I've not found any public assays of its iodine content. So seriously, do avoid other brands of sea salt. And I would also avoid the Himalayan salt, the pink Himalayan salt. And again, please don't feel like you're going to become mineral depleted by avoiding them because they weren't making you mineral replete anyway. They weren't really contributing anything that was useful. So yeah, general ideas there. And then we think about salt in processed foods. That's the next question that comes up. So I'm being careful about the salt that I'm cooking with, but what if I buy, a sauce or a thing here or there? Well, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have those things, but we don't live in a perfect world, so they are there. And, we'll use mustard, we'll use convenient soy sauce here and there. By and large, try to find things that are listing just salt as opposed to sea salt. You can't always make that choice, but it's relevant when that same processed food also has some flour, like if it's a baked good, or if there's dairy products or egg yolks, or if it's seafood. If it's not something that contains other big sources of iodine, it's not likely to have high amounts of iodine just from the salt. And I base that off of assays of various foods. So shopping list, get yourself some Diamond brand kosher salt for cooking, get yourself some Malden's brand finishing salt for finishing, especially the smoked. The latter I do see occasionally in larger health food supermarkets. I get that online from the manufacturer or from major retailers that are named after big rivers in South America. And that's an easy way to do it. So that's a deep dive in all things salt. I hope that was useful. Dr. C here with you, and I'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much, and I'll be back with you real soon. Bye bye.